Nevada's deserts hide more than empty space. Beneath dry lake beds, volcanic hills, and forgotten caves lie traces of ancient lives that still raise questions today. From Ice Age petroglyphs and mysterious burials, to abandoned villages and ritual sites, these places challenge what we think we know about the earliest people to cross and settle the Great Basin. Winnemucca Lake Petroglyphs. Winnemucca Lake lies in western Nevada, a wide, quiet basin that looks almost forgotten by time. Most days it is dry, its surface cracked and pale, stretching toward low mountains under an open sky. There is very little here to signal importance, no dramatic ruins, no towering stonework, and yet hidden along the limestone outcrops near what was once the shoreline are carvings that may completely rewrite how early human history in North America is understood. These are the Winnemucca Lake Petroglyphs, and they are unsettling, not because of what they show, but because of what they suggest. Some researchers believe these carvings could be over 14,000 years old. That would place them deep in the Ice Age, long before agriculture, long before permanent settlements, and long before the timelines most people still imagine for the peopling of the Americas. To understand why this matters, you first have to picture the landscape as it once was. Winnemucca Lake was not always dry. During the last Ice Age, it was part of a massive body of water known as Lake Lahontan. This ancient lake covered much of what is now northwestern Nevada, with shorelines miles away from where they sit today. The limestone ridges where the petroglyphs are found would have stood right at the water's edge. Boats could have passed beneath them. People could have gathered there with the lake stretching out in front of them. The carvings themselves are deeply incised into the rock. These are not light scratches or casual marks. Many grooves are cut several centimeters deep, with sharp edges that have survived thousands of years of weathering. The designs are almost entirely abstract. Zigzag patterns, long straight grooves, nested diamonds, branching lines that resemble lightning or flowing water. There are no obvious animals, no hunting scenes, no human figures. That alone sets this site apart from much of the rock art found elsewhere in North America. The abstract nature of the symbols is part of what makes them so difficult to interpret. Some researchers believe they may represent water, waves, or changing lake levels. Others think they could be symbolic maps, territorial markers, or ceremonial signs tied to rituals performed at the shoreline. There is also the possibility that the designs held meanings that were never meant to be literal in the first place. They may represent ideas, stories, or beliefs that no longer exist in any recoverable form. Dating the petroglyphs has been one of the most controversial aspects of the site. Rock art is notoriously difficult to date directly, because stone does not contain organic material. At Winnemucca Lake, scientists turned to indirect methods. One approach involved dating carbonate deposits that formed over some of the carvings. These mineral layers build up slowly over time, and by dating them, researchers can estimate when the carvings must have been made before the deposits formed. The results were surprising, even uncomfortable. Some dates suggested the carvings could be as old as 14,800 years. That would make them among the oldest known petroglyphs in the world, not just in North America. Such a timeline challenges long-held assumptions about when humans arrived in the region and what they were capable of at that time. Not everyone agrees with these conclusions. Critics argue that carbonate dating can be unreliable and that environmental factors may have affected the results. Others suggest the carvings could have been reworked over time, with older grooves modified or deepened by later groups. These debates have not been fully resolved, and that uncertainty remains central to the mystery. The science does not offer a clean answer, and the site refuses to settle into a comfortable category. What is harder to dispute is the level of effort involved. Creating grooves this deep in limestone would have taken time, strength, and repeated motion using stone tools. This was not the work of people passing through casually. Whoever made these carvings chose this location deliberately and invested energy into marking it in a way meant to last. One question that often comes up is who made them. Modern Native American tribes in the region recognize the area as culturally important, but the potential age of the carvings suggests they may predate known tribal histories. This does not disconnect them from indigenous heritage, but it does complicate the story. It raises the possibility that multiple cultures over thousands of years interacted with this site, each bringing their own interpretations to markings that were already ancient. There is also the possibility that even later prehistoric peoples encountered these carvings and wondered about their origin. The petroglyphs may have been a mystery almost from the moment they were created. That idea that humans have been puzzling over these symbols for thousands of years adds a quiet depth to the site that is hard to ignore. Standing at Winnemucca Lake today, feels different from visiting more dramatic archaeological locations. There are no crowds, no visitor center explaining everything in neat panels. The silence is heavy, broken only by wind and the distant sound of insects. When you approach the carved rock faces, the designs reveal themselves slowly. You notice how deliberate the lines are, how consistent the patterns feel, how they seem placed with intention rather than decoration. The environment itself adds to the unease. The dryness of the lakebed contrasts sharply with the idea that this was once a thriving waterscape. It forces you to imagine a completely different world. Water where there is dust, movement where there is stillness, life gathered around a lake that no longer exists. Some interpretations suggest the petroglyphs could be tied to changing climate conditions. If the carvings were made as water levels rose or fell, they may record environmental knowledge passed down through generations. In that sense, they could represent a form of early information storage, a way of encoding memory into stone. If true, this would place the creators among the earliest known humans to permanently mark environmental knowledge into the landscape. Others see a spiritual dimension. The repetition of certain patterns suggests ritual behavior rather than random marking. The location at the shoreline, a boundary between land and water, may have held symbolic meaning. Many cultures see such boundaries as powerful places, suitable for ceremonies, offerings, or communication with the unseen. In the present day, the site is protected, though not heavily developed. Access is limited, and that is likely for the best. Rock art is more fragile than it appears. A single careless touch or act of vandalism can erase details that survived for millennia. The greatest threat is not time, but modern neglect or curiosity without respect. What stays with most people who visit is not a sense of solving a mystery, but the opposite. Winnemucca Lake does not give answers easily. It reminds you how much of human history exists beyond certainty. It forces you to accept that some stories are incomplete, and some meanings are lost forever. My own impression is that the Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs matter less for what they definitively prove, and more for what they challenge. They challenge the idea that early humans in North America were simple or unsophisticated. They challenge neat timelines, and they challenge our desire for clear explanations. These carvings sit quietly in the desert, older than memory, older than language, reminding us that people have been thinking symbolically, creatively, and deliberately for far longer than we often admit. Whether they marked territory, recorded knowledge, or expressed beliefs we no longer understand, they stand as one of Nevada's most profound ancient mysteries, not because they hide something dramatic, but because they reveal how deep and uncertain the human story really is. Spirit Cave Mummy. Spirit Cave sits quietly in the desert hills near Fallon, Nevada. From the outside, it does not look like a place that would challenge decades of archaeological certainty. It is a shallow limestone cave, unremarkable in size, tucked into a dry, rocky landscape shaped by wind and time. But what was found inside in 1940 would eventually force scientists, museums, and government agencies to rethink some of their deepest assumptions about who the earliest Americans were and where they came from. When archaeologists excavated Spirit Cave, they uncovered the naturally mummified remains of a man wrapped in Tulu reed matting. Alongside him were sandals, rabbit skin blankets, and other organic materials preserved by the cave's dry conditions. At the time, the find was important, but not revolutionary. Early estimates placed the burial at around 1,500 to 2,000 years old. The remains were cataloged, studied, and eventually stored in a museum, where they stayed for decades. Everything changed in the 1990s, when more advanced dating methods were applied. Radiocarbon testing revealed something no one expected. The Spirit Cave mummy was not a few thousand years old. He was over 10,600 years old. That placed him firmly in the early Holocene period, making him one of the oldest known human remains ever discovered in North America. This discovery alone would have been enough to make Spirit Cave a landmark site, but what truly turned it into an ancient mystery was what came next. Physical anthropologists studying the remains noted features that did not neatly match what they expected of early Native American populations. The skull shape and facial structure appeared different from modern tribal groups in the region. Some researchers suggested affinities with ancient populations from Asia or even Europe. These interpretations were controversial, and they quickly spilled beyond academic circles into legal and cultural conflict. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGRPRA, federally funded institutions are required to return ancestral remains to affiliated tribes. The Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe requested the return of the spirit cave mummy, asserting cultural and ancestral ties to the region. However, the initial scientific assessments argued that cultural affiliation could not be clearly established due to the extreme age of the remains. For nearly 2 decades, the mummy became the center of a tense standoff. Scientists wanted more time to study him. The tribe wanted him returned for proper reburial. During this period, the remains stayed in museum storage, inaccessible to the public, while debates over ancestry, identity, and scientific authority played out behind closed doors. What makes this part of the story uncomfortable is that it exposed a deeper issue in archaeology. For much of its history, the field treated ancient human remains as data first and people second. Spirit Cave forced a reckoning with that mindset. This was not just a skeleton. This was a person who had lived, died, and been buried with care by people who mattered to him. The mystery deepened again in the 2010s, when advances in ancient DNA analysis made it possible to test genetic relationships directly. With the tribe's involvement and consent, DNA was extracted and compared to modern populations. The results were clear. The Spirit Cave mummy was most closely related to Native American groups, including the Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe. This finding overturned earlier assumptions based solely on physical appearance. It demonstrated that skull shape alone is an unreliable indicator of ancestry, especially when dealing with deep time. More importantly, it confirmed what the tribe had said all along. This individual was their ancestor. In 2016, the Spirit Cave mummy was finally returned to the tribe and reburied in a private ceremony. His scientific name faded from public use, replaced by a more human recognition of his place in living history. But the questions he raised did not disappear with his reburial. One of the enduring mysteries of Spirit Cave is what his life might have been like. At the time he lived, Nevada looked very different. The region was wetter, cooler, and dotted with lakes and wetlands left behind by the retreat of Ice Age glaciers. People lived as hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally, relying on detailed knowledge of plants, animals, and water sources. The burial itself suggests care and intention. The body was wrapped tightly in tool mats, a material harvested from wetlands. This was not a casual disposal of the dead. It was a deliberate act, one that required time and planning. That alone tells us something important about early social structures. These people had rituals, beliefs, and respect for the dead long before agriculture or permanent settlements. There is also the question of why Spirit Cave was chosen as a burial site. Caves often hold symbolic meaning across cultures. They can represent protection, transition, or connection between worlds. Whether that symbolism applied here is impossible to say for certain, but the choice feels intentional rather than random. From a scientific perspective, Spirit Cave reshaped understanding of early migration into the Americas. His age supports the idea that humans were present in the Great Basin far earlier than once believed. It also suggests that early populations were more diverse and adaptable than earlier models allowed. These were not people barely surviving at the edge of the continent. They were thriving, adapting, and establishing cultural practices that endured for thousands of years. Visiting the area today does not feel dramatic. The cave is protected, and access is restricted. The surrounding landscape is quiet and open, with long views and little shade. It is easy to imagine small groups moving through this terrain, following seasonal patterns that only they fully understood. Standing there, the story feels less like ancient history and more like a reminder of continuity. One of the most important legacies of the Spirit Cave mummy is how it changed the relationship between science and indigenous communities. It showed that collaboration leads to better answers than conflict. The DNA results were stronger precisely because tribal knowledge and consent were part of the process. In that sense, Spirit Cave is not just an ancient mystery, but a modern lesson. What lingers most is the human element. For decades, this man existed as an object of debate, locked in storage while arguments played out over his identity. Now, he rests again in the land he came from. That feels like a quiet resolution, even if the broader questions remain. My own impression is that the Spirit Cave mummy matters, because he bridges past and present in a way few discoveries do. He reminds us that the ancient world is not disconnected from the living one. The people who walked Nevada's landscapes 10,000 years ago were not abstract ancestors. They were human beings with families, traditions, and beliefs that still echo today. The mystery of Spirit Cave is not just about how old the remains are, or where early Americans came from. It is about how we choose to tell the story of the past, and who gets to be part of that telling. In that sense, Spirit Cave remains one of Nevada's most powerful ancient mysteries, not because it hides answers, but because it forces us to confront how we search for them. Grimes Point Petroglyph Complex. Grimes Point rises out of the Nevada desert just east of Fallon, a low stretch of volcanic rock scattered across a quiet hillside. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than dark boulders dropped randomly across the land. There are no walls, no ruins, no obvious structures, but once you slow down and start looking closely, the surface of those rocks begins to change. Lines emerge, shapes repeat, patterns overlap. Before long, you realize you are standing in the middle of one of the densest and most puzzling concentrations of ancient rock art in North America. The Grimes Point Petroglyph Complex contains thousands of carvings spread across basalt boulders formed by volcanic activity more than 100,000 years ago. The petroglyphs themselves are much younger, but still ancient by any standard. Most estimates place them between 2,000 and 8,000 years old, with some possibly even older. That means generations of people returned to this exact place over thousands of years, adding marks to stone that was already marked, contributing to something larger than any single moment in time. What makes Grimes Point especially mysterious is not just the number of petroglyphs, but their variety. There are spirals, concentric circles, zigzag lines, grids, dots, arcs, and shapes that defy easy description. Some resemble abstract maps. Others look almost mathematical. A few suggest animals or tracks, but most resist clear interpretation. There is no single style, no obvious narrative, and no clear beginning or end. Unlike rock art found deep in caves or hidden canyons, Grimes Point is open and exposed. The carvings are out in the landscape, visible to anyone walking through. That choice alone says something important. These were not private markings. They were meant to be seen. The question is by whom, and for what reason? To understand why this place mattered, you have to imagine the environment thousands of years ago. During much of the period when the petroglyphs were carved, this area sat near the edge of wetlands fed by the remnants of ancient Lake Lahontan. Water, plants, fish, and game would have drawn people here seasonally. This was not an empty desert, it was a resource-rich landscape, a natural gathering point. One theory suggests Grimes Point functioned as a crossroads. Groups moving through the Great Basin may have passed through this area regularly, following seasonal routes tied to water and food. The petroglyphs could have served as markers, signaling territory, shared meeting grounds, or safe passage. The repetition of certain symbols across multiple boulders hints at shared meaning, something understood by those who moved through the region. Another interpretation leans towards ceremony and ritual. Many of the symbols, especially spirals and concentric circles, appear across cultures worldwide in spiritual contexts. They are often associated with cycles, movement, time, or transformation. At Grimes Point, these symbols are not isolated. They appear again and again, sometimes layered over older carvings, as if later visitors were deliberately engaging with what came before. This layering is one of the most fascinating aspects of the site. In several places, newer carvings cut through older ones. This was not accidental. It suggests that later groups recognized the existing petroglyphs and chose to add to them rather than avoid them. That kind of interaction implies respect, continuity, or perhaps a desire to connect with ancestors whose identities were already fading into the past. There is also the question of sound and movement. The basalt rocks at Grimes Point have unusual acoustic properties. Some researchers and visitors have noted that certain areas amplify sound or produce echoes when struck. While this is difficult to prove conclusively, it raises the possibility that the site was chosen not just for its location, but for how it felt and sounded. In many cultures, places with unusual sensory qualities become sacred or symbolic. Dating the petroglyphs at Grimes Point is challenging. Like all rock art, they cannot be dated directly. Archaeologists rely on nearby artifacts, such as stone tools and campsites, as well as weathering patterns. What is clear is that the site was used repeatedly over a very long time. This was not a one-off project or the work of a single group. It was a long conversation carried out across generations, carved into stone instead of spoken aloud. One of the enduring mysteries is whether the petroglyphs had a fixed meaning, or whether their meanings changed over time. A spiral carved 7,000 years ago may not have meant the same thing to someone carving a similar spiral 3,000 years later. The symbol may have endured even as its interpretation shifted. That kind of symbolic continuity without fixed definition is hard for modern minds to grasp, but it is entirely possible. There is also the uncomfortable reality that much of what we might once have known about Grimes Point is gone. Oral traditions fade, languages change, entire cultures rise and disappear. What remains are the stones stripped of context, asking questions they can no longer answer. Archaeology can describe patterns, but meaning often stays just out of reach. Visiting Grimes Point today is a quiet experience. The site is protected and accessible by a short walk from a parking area. There are signs asking visitors not to touch the carvings, and for good reason. The petroglyphs were created by pecking away the dark outer layer of basalt to reveal lighter stone beneath. Even light contact can damage that surface. What survived thousands of years can be erased in moments. Walking among the boulders, you become aware of how deliberate the placement feels. Certain rocks are heavily carved, while others nearby are untouched. Some panels face outward toward the valley, others inward toward the hillside. It feels organized, even if the organizing principle is no longer obvious. This was not random decoration. It was purposeful engagement with the landscape. One idea that continues to surface is that Grimes Point functioned as a teaching place. Symbols may have been used to pass on knowledge, stories, or survival information to younger generations. Carving into stone would ensure that the lesson endured even if people moved on. If that is true, then these petroglyphs are not art in the modern sense, but memory made permanent. In the present day, Grimes Point sits in a strange position. It is protected, studied, and photographed, yet still largely misunderstood. It does not offer a single dramatic story that can be neatly summarized. Instead, it offers accumulation, thousands of small acts, repeated over thousands of years, layered into something that feels meaningful, even if we cannot explain why. My own impression is that Grimes Point matters because it shows how long humans have been drawn to certain places, not just for survival, but for expression. This was a landscape people returned to again and again, choosing to leave something of themselves behind. They did not build monuments meant to dominate the land. They marked it quietly, patiently, trusting stone to carry their presence forward. The mystery of Grimes Point is not about decoding a single symbol or finding a lost civilization. It is about understanding why people felt compelled to speak through rock for so long. Whatever those messages meant, they were important enough to repeat, important enough to preserve, and important enough to return to, generation after generation. And standing there today, surrounded by silence and stone, it is hard not to feel that something of that intention still lingers. Lovelock Cave, Archaeological Mystery. Lovelock Cave sits in a low limestone ridge overlooking the Humboldt Sink in northern Nevada. From a distance, it looks like a shallow opening in the rock, easy to miss if you are not looking for it. There is nothing dramatic about its entrance, no towering cliff face, no sense of grandeur, and yet this cave has produced one of the strangest and most debated archaeological records in the American West. Long before archaeologists arrived, the cave already held meaning. Piri oral tradition speaks of a group known as the Site Ka, described as red-haired people who lived in the region and came into violent conflict with the ancestors of the Piriut. According to the story, the final survivors of this group were driven into a cave and killed when a fire was set at the entrance. For generations, this story was passed down as history, not myth. In 1911, miners digging for bat guano broke into Lovelock Cave, and what they found immediately drew attention. Beneath layers of guano were human bones, artifacts, and woven materials preserved by the cave's dry environment. This was not a single burial or a short-term shelter. It was a deep, complex deposit representing thousands of years of human activity. Formal excavations began soon after, led by archaeologists from the University of California. What they uncovered was remarkable. Over 10,000 artifacts were removed from the cave, including finely woven baskets, duck decoys made of tule reeds, sandals, nets, tools, and weapons. Some of these items dated back more than 4,000 years, making them among the oldest known examples of their kind. The duck decoys alone changed how archaeologists understood early hunting practices. These were not crude objects. They were carefully constructed, realistic in shape, and clearly designed for use in wetland environments. This suggested a level of planning and environmental knowledge that challenged stereotypes of Great Basin hunter-gatherers as simplistic or purely opportunistic. Human remains were also found, and this is where the mystery deepened. Some skulls were described as unusually large or elongated. Hair found with some of the remains appeared reddish or brownish in color. Almost immediately, sensational interpretations began to spread. Newspapers and later fringe writers claimed the cave proved the existence of a lost race of giants. Mainstream archaeology does not support the idea of giants. The skeletal remains fall within normal human size ranges, and hair color can change due to environmental factors after death. Dark hair often lightens or reddens over time due to chemical exposure. Even so, the persistence of these claims speaks to how unusual the site felt, even to early investigators. What cannot be dismissed is the scale and intensity of occupation. Lovelock Cave was not just a temporary camp. It appears to have been used repeatedly over thousands of years, possibly as a storage site, refuge, and seasonal shelter. Layers of ash suggest fires were built inside, sometimes extensively. Some researchers believe parts of the cave were intentionally burned, though whether this was accidental, practical, or ritual remains unclear. The possibility of a violent event lingers largely because of the Paiute oral tradition. While archaeology has not confirmed a single massacre event exactly as described, it has not disproven it either. The presence of burned materials and human remains leaves room for interpretation. Oral histories are often dismissed because they do not fit neatly into scientific frameworks, but Lovelock Cave reminds us that they can preserve echoes of real events, even if details change over time. Another puzzle is the apparent shift in how the cave was used. Earlier layers show intensive use connected to wetland resources. Later layers suggest abandonment or far less frequent visitation. This aligns with environmental changes in the region. As Lake Lahontan receded and wetlands dried up, the area became less hospitable. The cave story is tied directly to climate change, long before the modern era. One of the most overlooked mysteries of Lovelock Cave is how advanced some of the textile work is. The baskets and nets show complex weaving techniques that would not look out of place in much later periods. This suggests knowledge passed down over many generations. Skills like these do not appear suddenly. They reflect long traditions of teaching and refinement. There is also the question of why the cave became such a focal point. In a landscape filled with open shelters and rock overhangs, Lovelock Cave stands out for its depth and dryness. It would have been ideal for storage, especially for organic materials that would spoil elsewhere. This makes it possible that the cave functioned as a central resource cache, a place people returned to again and again. Over time, however, Lovelock Cave became something else. After excavation, many artifacts were removed to museums, and the site itself was altered. Guano mining disturbed layers that can never be reconstructed. Early excavation methods were not as careful as modern standards demand. As a result, some context was lost forever. This loss adds another layer to the mystery, because we will never fully know how all the pieces fit together. Today, the cave is protected, but it feels strangely empty. The artifacts that once filled it are gone. What remains is a hollow space and the weight of what used to be there. Standing inside, you can still see blackened ceilings from ancient fires and imagine the sound of people moving in the dark, the smell of smoke, the sense of enclosure and safety. Lovelock Cave occupies a strange place in public imagination. For some, it is proof of lost civilizations or forbidden history. For others, it is a cautionary tale about how myth can overshadow evidence. The truth sits somewhere in between. The cave does not need giants to be extraordinary. Its real significance lies in how much it reveals about adaptability, memory, and conflict in the ancient Great Basin. What makes Lovelock Cave enduringly mysterious is how it blends archaeology and oral history without fully resolving either. The artifacts tell one story, the Paiute traditions tell another. They overlap in places and diverge in others. Instead of choosing one and dismissing the other, the site invites us to sit with that tension. My own impression is that Lovelock Cave is unsettling because it feels unfinished. It hints at lives lived under pressure, at environmental change, at conflict and cooperation, and at knowledge passed down through generations. It reminds us that ancient people were not static or simple. They adapted, they remembered, and they told stories about what happened to them. The mystery of Lovelock Cave is not about giants or sensational claims. It is about how history survives in fragments, in objects, in stories, and in places. And sometimes, those fragments refuse to line up neatly. When that happens, the discomfort we feel says less about the past and more about our need for certainty.